Another striking exemplification of perseverance and industry in the cultivation of art in humble life is presented in the career of James Sharples, a working blacksmith at Blackburn. He was born at Wakefield in Yorkshire, in 1825, one of a family of 13 children. His father was a working iron founder, and removed to Bury to follow his business. The boys received no school education, but were all sent to work as soon as they were able. And at about 10 James was placed in a foundry, where he was employed for about 2 years as smithy boy. After that he was sent into the engine shop where his father worked as engine smith. The boy's employment was to heat and carry rivets for the boilermakers. Though his hours of labor were very long, often from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, his father contrived to give him some little teaching after working hours. And it was thus that he partially learned his letters. An incident occurred in the course of his employment among the boilermakers, which first awakened in him the desire to learn drawing. He had occasionally been employed by the foreman to hold the chalk line with which he made the designs of boilers upon the floor of the workshop. And on such occasions the foreman was accustomed to hold the line, and direct the boy to make the necessary dimensions. James soon became so expert at this as to be of considerable service to the foreman. And at his leisure hours at home his great delight was to practice drawing designs of boilers upon his mother's floor. On one occasion, when a female relative was expected from Manchester to pay the family a visit, and the house had been made as decent as possible for her reception, the boy, on coming in from the foundry in the evening, began his usual operations upon the floor. He had proceeded some way with his design of a large boiler in chalk, when his mother arrived with a visitor, and to her dismay found the boy unwashed and the floor chalked all over. The relative, however, professed to be pleased with the boy's industry, praised his design, and recommended his mother to provide the little sweep, as she called him, with paper and pencils. Encouraged by his elder brother, he began to practice figure and landscape drawing, making copies of lithographs, but as yet without any knowledge of the rules of perspective and the principles of light and shade. He worked on, however, and gradually acquired expertness in copying. At 16, he entered the Bury Mechanics Institution in order to attend the drawing class, taught by an amateur who followed the trade of a barber. There he had a lesson a week during 3 months. The teacher recommended him to obtain from the library Burnet's practical treatise on painting. But as he could not yet read with ease, he was under the necessity of getting his mother, and sometimes his elder brother, to read passages from the book for him while he sat by and listened. Feeling hampered by his ignorance of the art of reading, and eager to master the contents of Burnet's book, he ceased attending the drawing class at the Institute after the first quarter, and devoted himself to learning reading and writing at home. In this he soon succeeded, and when he again entered the Institute and took out Burnet a second time, he was not only able to read it, but to make written extracts for further use. So ardently did he study the volume, that he used to rise at 4 o'clock in the morning to read it and copy out passages. After which he went to the foundry at 6, worked until 6 and sometimes 8 in the evening, and returned home to enter with fresh zest upon the study of Burnet, which he continued often until a late hour. Parts of his nights were also occupied in drawing and making copies of drawings. On one of these, a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, he spent an entire night. He went to bed indeed, but his mind was so engrossed with the subject that he could not sleep, and rose again to resume his pencil. He next proceeded to try his hand at painting in oil, for which purpose he procured some canvas from a draper, stretched it on a frame, coated it over with white lead, and began painting on it with colors bought from a house painter. But his work proved a total failure, for the canvas was rough and knotty, and the paint would not dry. In his extremity he applied to his old teacher, the barber, from whom he first learned that prepared canvas was to be had, and that there were colors and varnishes made for the special purpose of oil painting. As soon therefore, as his means would allow, He bought a small stock of the necessary articles and began afresh, his amateur master showing him how to paint. And the pupil succeeded so well that he excelled the master's copy. His first picture was a copy from an engraving called Sheep Shearing, and was afterwards sold by him for £0.50. Aided by a shilling guide to oil painting, he went on working at his leisure hours, and gradually acquired a better knowledge of his materials. He made his own easel and palette knife, and paint chest. He bought his paint, brushes, and canvas, as he could raise the money by working overtime. This was the slender fund which his parents consented to allow him for the purpose. The burden of supporting a very large family precluding them from doing more. Often he would walk to Manchester and back in the evenings to buy 2 or 3 shillings worth of paint and canvas, returning almost at midnight, after his 18 miles walk, sometimes wet through and completely exhausted, but borne up throughout by his inexhaustible hope and invincible determination. The further progress of the self-taught artist is best narrated in his own words, as communicated by him in a letter to the author. The next pictures I painted, he says, were a landscape by moonlight, a fruit piece, and 1 or 2 others. After which I conceived the idea of painting the forge. I had for some time thought about it, but had not attempted to embody the conception in a drawing. I now, however, made a sketch of the subject upon paper, and then proceeded to paint it on canvas. The picture simply represents the interior of a large workshop such as I have been accustomed to work in, although not of any particular shop. It is, therefore, to this extent, an original conception. Having made an outline of the subject, I found that, before I could proceed with it successfully, a knowledge of anatomy was indispensable to enable me accurately to delineate the muscles of the figures. My brother Peter came to my assistance at this juncture, and kindly purchased for me Flaxman's Anatomical Studies. A work altogether beyond my means at the time, for it cost 24 shillings. This book I looked upon as a great treasure, and I studied it laboriously, rising at 3 o'clock in the morning to draw after it, and occasionally getting my brother Peter to stand for me as a model at that untimely hour. Although I gradually improved myself by this practice, it was some time before I felt sufficient confidence to go on with my picture. I also felt hampered by my want of knowledge of perspective, which I endeavored to remedy by carefully studying Brooke Taylor's principles. And shortly after I resumed my painting. While engaged in the study of perspective at home, I used to apply for and obtain leave to work at the heavier kinds of smith work at the foundry, and for this reason, the time required for heating the heaviest ironwork is so much longer than that required for heating the lighter, that it enabled me to secure a number of spare minutes in the course of the day, which I carefully employed in making diagrams and perspective upon the sheet iron casing in front of the hearth at which I worked. Thus assiduously working and studying, James Sharples steadily advanced in his knowledge of the principles of art, and acquired greater facility in its practice. Some 18 months after the expiry of his apprenticeship he painted a portrait of his father, which attracted considerable notice in the town, as also did the picture of the forge, which he finished soon after. His success in portrait painting obtained for him a commission from the foreman of the shop to paint a family group, and Sharples executed it so well that the foreman not only paid him the agreed price of £18, but 30 shillings to boot. While engaged on this group he ceased to work at the foundry, and he had thoughts of giving up his trade altogether and devoting himself exclusively to painting. He proceeded to paint several pictures, amongst others a head of Christ, an original conception, life-size, and a view of Barry. But not obtaining sufficient employment at portraits to occupy his time, or give him the prospect of a steady income, he had the good sense to resume his leather apron, and go on working at his honest trade of a blacksmith, employing his leisure hours in engraving his picture of the forge, since published. He was induced to commence the engraving by the following circumstance. A Manchester picture dealer, to whom he showed the painting, let drop the observation that in the hands of a skillful engraver it would make a very good print. Sharples immediately conceived the idea of engraving it himself, though altogether ignorant of the art. The difficulties which he encountered and successfully overcame in carrying out his project are thus described by himself. I had seen an advertisement of a Sheffield steel plate maker, giving a list of the prices at which he supplied plates of various sizes, and, fixing upon one of suitable dimensions, I remitted the amount, together with a small additional sum for which I requested him to send me a few engraving tools. I could not specify the articles wanted, for I did not then know anything about the process of engraving. However, there duly arrived with the plate 3 or 4 gravers and an etching needle. The latter I spoiled before I knew its use. While working at the plate, the Amalgamated Society of Engineers offered a premium for the best design for an emblematical picture, for which I determined to compete, and I was so fortunate as to win the prize. Shortly after this I removed to Blackburn, where I obtained employment at Messrs. Yates, Engineers, as an engine smith, and continued to employ my leisure time in drawing, painting, and engraving, as before. With the engraving I made but very slow progress, owing to the difficulties I experienced from not possessing proper tools. I then determined to try to make some that would suit my purpose, and after several failures I succeeded in making many that I have used in the course of my engraving. I was also greatly at a loss for want of a proper magnifying glass, and part of the plate was executed with no other assistance of this sort than what my father's spectacles afforded, though I afterwards succeeded in obtaining a proper magnifier, which was of the utmost use to me. An incident occurred while I was engraving the plate, which had almost caused me to abandon it altogether. It sometimes happened that I was obliged to lay it aside for a considerable time, when other work pressed. And in order to guard it against rust, I was accustomed to rub over the graven parts with oil. But on examining the plate after one of such intervals, I found that the oil had become a dark sticky substance extremely difficult to get out. I tried to pick it out with a needle, but found that it would almost take as much time as to engrave the parts afresh. I was in great despair at this, but at length hit upon the expedient of boiling it in water containing soda, and afterwards rubbing the engraved parts with a toothbrush, and to my delight found the plan succeeded perfectly. My greatest difficulties now over, patience and perseverance were all that were needed to bring my labors to a successful issue. I had neither advice nor assistance from anyone in finishing the plate. If, therefore, the work possess any merit, I can claim it as my own. And if in its accomplishment I have contributed to show what can be done by persevering industry and determination, it is all the honor I wish to lay claim to. It would be beside our purpose to enter upon any criticism of the forge as an engraving, its merits having been already fully recognized by the art journals. The execution of the work occupied Sharples's leisure evening hours during a period of 5 years. And it was only when he took the plate to the printer that he for the first time saw an engraved plate produced by any other man. To this unvarnished picture of industry and genius, we add one other trait, and it is a domestic one. I have been married 7 years, says he, and during that time my greatest pleasure, after I have finished my daily labor at the foundry, has been to resume my pencil or graver, frequently until a late hour of the evening. My wife meanwhile sitting by my side and reading to me from some interesting book, a simple but beautiful testimony to the thorough common sense as well as the genuine right-heartedness of this most interesting and deserving workman.